everybody. Welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host today. I'm Colin Campbell, the Director of Marketing at Sales Hacker. And today we're talking about intent data. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to talk about a lot of things about intent data. We're going to try to clarify a few things, but really what we want to talk about is how to operationalize it, how to make it actionable at different stages of the sales funnel. So like, how do you set up intent data with your CRM, your sales engagement platform, your marketing automation platform, and use it in each of those places? How do you set up your outbound teams so that they can use intent data in a good way in their outbound motions? And then like, what are the things that SDRs or BDRs shouldn't say or shouldn't use intent data for? We'll even talk about things like using intent data for lead scoring and prioritization, and a whole lot more. So if you have questions, we want you to tell us. We'll take questions throughout. And our excellent panel today that's going to teach us about all of that stuff is, so we're first, Brett Merle. He's the Outbound Sales Manager at Active Campaign, an omnichannel marketing automation platform. Welcome, Brett. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you. Wouldn't have it any other way. We're also joined by Adam Goyette, the VP of Demand Generation at G2, formerly G2 Crowd. Welcome, Adam. You like how I got the new brand name right?
Well, that was good. I'm impressed. I sometimes get it wrong, so.
You know what? All the teachers said I wasn't a fast learner, but I got it.
Look at you now.
Look at me now. And then we've also got Chris Laird, Sales Development Manager at Outreach. Chris, thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So this whole crew, as you can tell, there's a couple different roles here. They cover a few different areas of knowledge. We've got marketing automation. We've got an intent data provider. We've got somebody in sales development, two people in sales development. So we're going to try to handle a lot of different questions here. And like I said, we want to take your questions. I'm the Director of Marketing at Sales Hacker, so it's my ass on the line if this doesn't go well. And one way to make it go really well is to be engaged and interact with us. You know, you're join the live version for a reason. So go down to the bottom of your screen right now, people watching, and click that little Q&A button. And when it pops open, tell us your name, your role, and your company. I want to get a sense of who's in the room with us. And then throughout the webinar, please use that Q&A box to ask us your questions, and I'll make sure they get answered. While you're all introducing yourselves, I'll also tell you that we are recording this webinar. So if you need to hop out for any reason, or you really just want to share this with a colleague afterwards, you will get a recording. Oh, a bunch of people typing in their name. Thanks, guys. Welcome, everybody. Courtney Corset, Roll, Paul, Barb. Hi. Philip. What a great gang. Bunch of sales development people. There's a director of partnerships here. Good variety. Okay, I expect good questions from you all because you seem like smart folks. One thing that I want to start off with, we're going to get right into it right now, is the fact that I think people throw around the term intent data to mean a lot of different things. And I know I've done it. So to make sure we're all talking about the same thing today, Adam, if you don't mind, I want to put it to you, what is intent data? And I assume that can mean a few different things. So what are the different types of intent data?
Yeah, so when you think of intent data, it's like you said, it's kind of become a little bit of a buzzword, I think. People throw it out in a lot of different providers out there. But really, it is supposed to be exactly what it is kind of labeled as, right? It's buyers out there in the market who are showing intent to purchase your product, right? And that's kind of the most fundamental look at that. I think there's a couple ways what that intent starts at, right? If you think about the buyer's journey, that intent might start with researching very top of the funnel type topics, right? Like, market automation tips and tricks, or why do I need a market automation system? And so it might be like a very high level content type search that it starts at. And that is a form of intent, but it really trickles down to the further down the funnel kind of intent where they're researching actual products. They're researching companies, they're looking at comparisons, they're reading reviews, and that's the intent data, here at G2 we're focused on. We have, 3 million people who come to our site every single month, and so we get a lot of that data. And really, I think that's the piece where, for this conversation, we're talking about how do we enable sales, and how do we actually operationalize intent data. That's the intent data I think we're focused on talking about today. Because if you think about it, right, like if I was to pass over to my sales team, like, hey, this person read like 5 best tips for marketing automation systems, you should call them. Chances are I would not be the most popular marketer here. And so I think like when you think about it, right, it's like what's actionable out of intent data? Not to say that other data is not important, but for this purposes, I think that further down the funnel kind of intent data is where we want to spend our time.
Okay, so when we think intent data, we should maybe think like intent to something data. So like one type of intent data you mentioned is maybe organic search, like in Google, if somebody searches for a marketing automation platform, that's an intent to learn more about marketing automation platforms. The intent data you're talking about is like intent to buy data, or at least intent to shop
Yeah,
data,
they're in
right?
the marketplace, right? Like if
Right.
you're on the crowd and you're comparing software vendors, most likely you're not just doing it for fun, right? Like if you think about the content world becomes a little bit tricky because I mean, I, just like every other marketer, probably consume a ton of content. I'm probably reading 20, 30 articles a day, or at least
Yeah.
looking at them, right? And so if you think about that, that's a much noisier world. So it's hard to say like the journey might start up there, but it usually leads further down the funnel, right? Where they're on a site like G2, like looking at the different providers.
Right. Okay. And so, so you're the marketer. Chris and Brett, you guys are more on the sales side. How do you think about intent data? Is it more or less line up, or do you think about it a different way?
So thanks for asking. Great question. So I think about the intent data in terms of like how it fills different buckets, right? So sort of on the front end, just to piggyback on kind of what we already were talking about, is sort of that brand awareness side and being able to capsulize the motion in terms of the initial buying and evaluation process. So one of the things that we do here at Active Campaign is we ride, for no better term, we ride that G2 partnership and G2's brand to help push our own brand. The second thing I think about is just biz dev and acquisition, right? Using intent data to feed like an outbound team like mine, so that we can target people who may not be actively raising their hands like we would get typically in a trial or an MQL, but are doing or in some type of buying motion as it stands. And then the last bucket I look at is account and management, success, and retention, right? So like we can look at who's a potential flight risk. So if we've got a current customer that we know is evaluating us against maybe some competitors, we can leverage that insight for our customer success team to maneuver and address that accordingly.
Okay, really interesting. We're going to get into some specifics. I know the attendees are probably want to hear more about like how you ride the G2 partnership, how your biz dev teams use intent data to identify those people who aren't hand raising. We're going to get into that. Chris, I wanted to put it to you real quick in case you have anything to add on this point.
Yeah, I think both Adam and Brett did a great job of kind of differentiating between when you have someone that maybe visited your website or downloaded a white page. Maybe it was like an ebook on a specific topic, whereas the buyer intent data that we're talking about today is really, it's a little bit more focused as to like you've got an account, somebody at an account that you're working is actively researching your space, your market, your industry, your product, your competitors. And it allows for an SDR team who, you know, an individual SDR might be working 250 accounts. It allows them to really just have a better idea of where they should be focusing their energy, and allows them to customize their messaging around the knowledge that you've got somebody at that account that's speaking language in your space, and you want to reach out to them because they're in that cycle of evaluating tools or even looking at potentially buying something, and you want to be top of mind. You want to be right there at their fingertips.
That's a super interesting point of differentiation, that when we talk about intent data, it's intent that's, I mean, you can tie it to an account, but it's a person that has taken some kind of action. So maybe it sounds like, Chris, you're using this to identify like buyer committees, or the point, maybe a champion, an early champion in an account who's like the first one exhibiting intent.
Yeah, and for our intent data, you don't necessarily know who the person is, but If your SDR or BDR team's trained around the key personas that they should be reaching out to that are in that decision-making tree, then it allows you to know this account is actively researching our space. We need to make sure that we're really honed in on all the key decision makers and stakeholders at the table, whether that be sales or marketing or sales operations or whatever your buying persona is, then allows you to kind of focus in and kind of hit them full force with value-driven messaging around what you're able to provide them in that space.
Right. Okay. Good. That makes sense. So what we know what intent data is. We know that there's different types that you can use it throughout the sales funnel. And we just got a really interesting question from Barb. I love when you join our webinars. Thanks for coming. Barb Giamenko always asks great questions on our webinars. So she's saying with GDPR, you have to prove that there was some kind of intent, or you at least have record that there was intent to subscribe or get some kind of messaging from your business in order to be in compliance with people in the EU. Different kind of intent than we're talking about today, right, guys?
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't think you're taking intent data and mass blasting that list, right? It's more of the sales outreach piece of it to accounts already working that you want to know about.
Yep. Just so to the extent that people may have heard intent floating around in the marketing and sales world in the last few years, there was intent as it relates to GDPR. That's a different thing than what we're talking about today in general. Okay, so one other thing that I want to talk about here, and I think it fits because we've got marketers and sales on the line. From what I've seen, a lot of times, like if I'm going to go buy out or purchase a tool that helps provide me with intent data, a lot of times that comes from a marketing budget. But it does sound like, when you actually end up putting that to use, it's something that affects sales quite a bit. So can you talk a little bit about that? Chris, maybe start us off. Like, what does the overlap look like there, and how do you communicate with marketing? And then how do you make sure you're getting from them like something that's actually useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about bridging the gap between sales and marketing with outreach, and it's really important that both teams and both decision makers are on the same page when it comes to evaluating a tool in the buyer intent space. Because as you mentioned, it definitely is a great asset for a marketing team, but there is a specific use case on the sales side that can be used specifically by your SDRs, your BDRs, as Brett mentioned, even your post-sales team. And it's important to make sure that when the team that's tasked to evaluate those tools and potentially decide on buying one, that they're including representatives from the sales team, the pre-sales and post-sales, because you want to make sure you get a solution that's going to fit all of those nooks and crannies and be able to give insight into the beginning of the funnel and as you move through the sales cycle and then into the customer life cycle, as Brett mentioned, to avoid any kind of potential churn risk or identify upsell and cross-sell opportunities.
Okay, so when you talk about getting a solution that's actually going to empower a sales rep with real insights, what is the thing that you want them to sit down, look at I assume they look at their screen and they see something. What's the nugget of data that you would call intent data? Like, what does it look like when the rep has intent data in front of them?
Knowing that someone at an account is researching your competitors is probably the most valuable and most quick actionable item. But even just knowing that the account is researching keywords in your space, for outreach, that's sales engagement. It could be sales automation. It could be sales enablement. There's a lot of different terms that you can enter into an intent tool to be able to give you that insight. And then being able to see it in a timeline is really important too. I always think it's interesting to see when I get the emails and see what accounts are kind of giving us that buyer intent hand raising. It's always neat to then go into outreach and look at the action that the SDR has been taking on that account and the action that marketing has been taking on that account to drive some of those people to visit sites, whether it be our site or our competitors' sites. There's almost always a correlation between an increase in SDR activity and then a highlight of that account coming in on the buyer intent side as well.
Okay, so you'd want the rep sits down and sees like Sarah searched for sales engagement
Yeah.
2 days ago, and then today Sarah searched for I don't know, outreach versus some competitor, and that's what the intent data will then look like when your SDR is sitting down and planning her outreach.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And it could even be somebody at the account searching another solution that's in a similar space, but not exactly an end-to-end solution, maybe a point solution. So it just allows you to know that this is specifically what they're looking for. They want to solve this pain that we can solve, but we can also solve 3 other pains as well. So it allows you to go into that communication with somebody at that account knowing what they're looking for based on what other tools and resources they're looking at.
Okay, so one use case is like this is really useful for named accounts where somebody's watching an account, waiting for the right time to jump in, maybe looking for the right contacts to speak to at the right time, and this is a tool to help them do that. I think you mentioned there were other use cases where you could see a biz dev team using this. What are those?
Yeah, so another great example is finding net new accounts that aren't in your current Salesforce instance or your CRM. So every once in a while you'll have a small account that maybe isn't on your radar, but they got a recent round of funding and now they're looking at different tools and to grow and scale. And all of a sudden those accounts start appearing on the buyer intent alerts. And now you can have somebody on your team or the marketing team even spend a little bit of extra time and focus on reaching out to that account and finding out what they're looking to solve, what problems they're looking to solve, or what challenges they have, whether they're looking to grow, how they're going to use that new funding. There's a great opportunity to just look for new accounts that you're not currently focused on.
Excellent. You almost kind of let the prospect do the work for you, but it's like a secret hand raise.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. And then actually, Brett, so you mentioned another use case earlier that I just remembered you mentioned, which was talking about avoiding churn, or maybe even you could use it for potential expansion renewals. Yep. Can you talk about a little bit about how intent data can be used in that use case?
Yeah, and I think first, I think Chris is exactly right. Everything he said is exactly how we use and I use the intent data on the biz dev side. I always, as well, just piggybacking on that, look at anything that a biz dev is doing from an outbound function and outbound sales as an extension synergizing with outbound marketing, right? So you're actively and proactively introducing a brand to someone who familiarity with your brand currently exists sort of in G2 Crowd through what they're comparing you to. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for pitch and catch on the marketing and sales sort of alignment. I think to the point around customer reducing churn and sort of customer retention, I think really it's the same use case, right? So you can understand if we have, so our business use case here, we have over 70,000 customers now all over the world, right? It's a very diverse pool. So that's also to say we're also in a very saturated, noisy space, right? The email marketing automation space. Yeah. Each platform will offer something a little bit different, right? Each engagement that someone from our customer success team or relationship manager has with a customer is also going to elicit different things in terms of their discovery and their finding. So I think leveraging the intent data in terms of what that's telling us and leveraging that really against what we have in CRM and what the details we know about our customers there can help us understand who's a flight risk. And I think one of the biggest things that all businesses face, especially pertaining to any service or SaaS business, MRR-based models, is keeping customers, right? It's one thing to gobble them up, but in a world that's sort of very noisy, where you can quickly transition over to different solutions, I think it's just as important to reduce churn and increase retention. And I think like the intent data is sort of, we haven't really even penetrated how we can use that yet in terms of the retention piece. It's sort of still evolving here at ActiveCampaign, but we are doing things like I know on the marketing side where that intent data is looked at daily. My outbound team that checks and scrubs against existing accounts that we have here. So like that will get raised as a red flag when we tag in our system. Current customer looking us up and comparing us to competitor. Right, and that information gets passed on to our customer success managers as well as our marketing teams to develop solutions and actions around it.
Okay, really cool. Like we were saying earlier, it sounds like you can kind of get into the mind of the customer prospect almost at any stage of their journey through using your product or buying your product or churning your product. Quick question for you, Adam. Actually, a couple questions. So we got a couple questions from the audience about like what the actual data, the little packet of data includes. So one question from Piyush, I hope I'm saying that right, is do you get insights about the additional insights about the person, like maybe other things that they're interested in? Like if I get a little alert, Sarah searched for XYZ, do I get extra information about Sarah?
Yeah, so one of the things we'll be able to provide, right, is on G2, you can actually run comparisons between you and other competitors. So I might run a comparison of like 5 different service providers, stack them all up, and literally run like a compare report. So we'll be able to tell you like, hey, who are you going up against? And so to the point of,
interesting.
it's interesting also for like, if you think about your competitors' churn, right? Like you might be able to in the know before their contract even ends that, hey, you're in the market, for this potential deal. And so I think like we talked a little bit about the sales and marketing. I think Brett, you call it the pitch and catch, right? But it's like it only works when it's both teams kind of tackling it together. If you're living in a world where it's like marketing's just like, hey, here's this great data, like good luck, like figuring out like how to operationalize it and stuff like that. I think it's really on the marketing team to help drive that forward, right? Like if you're in sales and your marketing team doesn't have a strategy around intent, I'd be a little scared if I were you, because there's tons of stats out there. Like I think it's like 90% of people are doing like their research before they ever come to your site and raise their hand, right? So like most of the time when you fill out a form and you think about your own personal use cases, right? Like I already know I want to talk to that company. I already know a lot about that solution. I've already read reviews. Like I'm kind of already sold a little bit, right? So like, how do you control that other part of that journey? And, for marketing, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, right? If I know that someone's comparing, our solution to someone else's, when I pass that data over to the sales team, I can also develop kill sheets, right? I can develop, our own compare reports to equip that salesperson with to go into that conversation. And, you mentioned like a lot of times it's not maybe necessarily a decision maker, but somebody who's doing that first champion or doing that initial research. We see that all the time, right? Where it might be the marketing manager doing the research, but it's the CMO who signs the contract, right?
Yep.
So like knowing those accounts, you can now start targeting the CMO at those accounts or, the VP and above on LinkedIn with ads around your offering. So like when it comes time for them to sit down and say like, hey, I'm thinking about, going with ActiveCampaign, they're like, oh yeah, I know ActiveCampaign. I've been seeing their stuff all over the place. Like, oh wow, what a coincidence, right? Like I think those coordinated plays, I think you yield such better results. And the worst thing we see is like when it's just like done in a bubble, either on the marketing side or on the sales side.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point. That this isn't something, because we noted marketing usually ends up buying this. It's not something they buy and then pass off to sales. The coordination comes in with like marketing air cover, and sales, feet on the ground, reaching out to the people that at the right time, really pointed interactions. Another really quick question, just in terms of what people get from G2 Crowd. This is a question from Alex Field. I get an alert. Does it say Sarah Thomas compared you to XYZ, or does it say like somebody at an account compared you to XYZ?
Someone at an account, I mean, due to GDPR and stuff, like all those, you can actually just release like who that person is. And the way we track it and stuff, it's more on an account-based level. So But again, if you're working in coordination and you know who your buyer personas are, it'd probably be easy to pinpoint.
Quick guesswork about, yeah, who would be.
Integration with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, so we actually recommend based off your personas and stuff, like who those potential contacts could be. So without, you never know explicitly like the person, and that's not a G2 thing, that's an everyone thing, right? Like nobody
Yeah.
that data.
Yep. Yeah. That maybe a little bit too invasive, like there's no privacy there. So this is, I mean, actually following up on that, on the question about like privacy and maybe the prospect perception of how people use intent data. And actually, this might be a good question for Chris. So Derek Ante is an SDR and asked, there's two questions kind of on this. He's an SDR being asked to use intent data from G2 and wants to know, Chris, what are your thoughts on being transparent around the intent you see on G2? Like, do you say, Mrs. Customer, I noticed that someone at your company has been looking for alternatives to XYZ tool? And then actually, so Ben Knuckles asked a similar question, which is like, just in general, how transparent are you with prospects in regards to that information?
Yeah, these are great questions, and something that I even get asked internally at Outreach. And I think the overarching answer is it depends on your company's process, how they would like you to use the intent. I think if that hasn't been established, I think it's really important to kind of lead that decision-making process, whether it's if you are an SDR leader or a sales leader. I think it's important to like put some framework around how you want your SDRs or your BDRs or anybody using intent data to use it, whether it be that it's something that you bake into a sequence or a cadence, or that it's it becomes part of the script. But I think here at Outreach, Adam brought this up, like everyone's being asked to be very research and customized when in your approach and your outbound communication with prospects. So the more you know, the more you can generate that level of respect and communication with a prospect. So knowing your buyer persona, knowing the challenges that those personas face in their day-to-day work, and then being able to just leverage that, here are the challenges that people in your role face. Are these similar to what you're facing today? And asking questions that gets them to kind of open up a little bit, and then saying as part of that conversation, are there other tools that you're considering using at this time or currently using in your tool stack to help solve some of these problems? And how are they working for you to help solve those challenges? How are they producing results? I think you can, depending on your level of relationship building with an account or with a prospect, I think you can just come out and say, hey, well, to be honest with you, I noticed that there's been some recent buyer intent activity on your account. People are researching the space and some of our competitors. So I wanted to reach out to you and see if we could just pick up a conversation about what challenges you're facing and what you'd like to solve.
Really interesting. So you've seen that work out okay with being like totally transparent? People aren't put off by that?
Yeah, I think it depends on who you're reaching out to, but what we've trained our SDRs to say if they get challenged on that is, I'm using my tool stack to its fullest capacity to understand my accounts and develop a relationship with my accounts. Isn't that something you want your sales reps to be doing as well? So if they get offended by it, I think it's just like, this is how I'm having a conversation with you today. This is how you and I are talking, because I've leveraged my tools in my stack to know where you're at in your buying cycle, what kind of funding you have, who are the buyer personas, who are the stakeholders. And then I'm using all that information to establish that relationship of sales to the company I'm reaching out to. So I think at the end of the day, like most sales leaders would want their reps to be that influenced by the information and research that's out there.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe it's like a game recognized game thing because you are a salesperson selling to the sales roles. But that makes a lot of sense. That level of transparency. the way that you phrased it, it's like, look, I'm just using the information at my disposal. Almost takes a little bit of the bite out of it, makes it seem less intrusive. Brett, I saw you nodding. Sounds like maybe you do similar things over there at ActiveCampaign. How do you guys handle that?
Yeah, so generally I tell my team not to proactively fly the flag of, hey, I saw you were looking us up and comparing us to, X competitor or looking at set features, right? Because I think to me, I think that the data is good enough and it's all the leverage that we need to make informed decisions in terms of what Chris talked about earlier, in terms of who we're targeting, where we're going to be able to be most efficient and maximize our efforts. That being said, I just totally agree with what he said, that if we are getting challenged, right? Because I think in this day and age, like the people that we're going on after most often are marketers here at ActiveCampaign. So if they're like, they call us out on, oh, that's interesting, like I was actually looking you guys up on G2, right? I encourage my team to have that conversation and to be transparent. Similar to what Chris said, like almost verbatim, I tell my team to say the same things. And I think that being honest and open about like how your tech stack is being used really only builds and fortifies a relationship in terms of like how we want to do business. So that's kind of how we approach it. We don't like actively kind of proactively go out and, in our emails and sequences and calls and say, hey, we're doing this. I saw you were looking us up on G2. But if it does sort of come around full circle, we do address it in a very similar way that Chris stated.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. I mean, both of you guys are selling to people that may end up using, it's within the family, right? Like recognized game situation. We did get a question from somebody on LinkedIn who thought that maybe it's like an industry sensitivity. It sounds like it might be more of like a persona or like a role sensitivity. I don't know if there is a sensitivity, actually. Adam, can you throw a little light on that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, explicitly stating it one way or another, I think one of the things is like, you actually don't know if that person is the person again, right? So like, I think also just from a sales perspective, like you going in saying like, hey, I saw you were researching us on G2. It's like, no, I wasn't. Like, click, right? What I mean? Like, and you completely missed the mark. Like, you should just knowing at the account level that's happening. And I think part of it is like, I guess the good thing about consumer brands is, right, like they've almost trained B2B companies a little bit more, and we're a few years behind, I think, in terms of like technology and retargeting, right? Like if you go on Zappos and you look at a pair of shoes, you're going to see that ad for the next like 10 weeks, like, and very explicit like details around like what you were looking at. I don't think anyone assumes that like their behavior on the internet is completely anonymous anymore. And so like run into that, I think using those types of examples, well, it's like, it's no different than like when break it down to like a consumer type behavior that they've seen before, right? I don't think that's that weird. It's no different than like the personalization on websites where I think like freaked people out, a few years ago. And now like if you see that, like nobody thinks twice of that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really something that I imagine is supposed to make the prospect have an easier time buying, so that when you start to have a conversation with them, you're not starting from ground zero. You have, whether you bring it up explicitly or not, you have some background on maybe what the conversations have been like within that account, maybe what they've seen or been interested in leading up to that point. Yeah. Okay. So let's get into like how this actually gets put in an outbound motion. We got some really good questions from Ron Nelson. Ron, thanks for hanging in there. Two good questions, and I want to like walk through step by step. Brett and Chris, what's the expectation when an SDR gets some form of intent data? So like, do they get an email? Is it in a dashboard somewhere? Is it like a task that pops up in Salesforce? Who owns that data? How does it get distributed? And then what's the expectation for what that SDR does when they see that a person is researching ActiveCampaign or outreach? Chris, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. This is probably the most important part as far as I'm concerned is how do you actually take action on it? Um, I know right now we have at Outreach, we have one person that kind of oversees how that buyer intent data is distributed out to the reps. Um, and that might sound like a really huge task, but that person currently is me, and it's not really a massive workload. Um, but basically, I think what it comes down to is it can be handled in any way, shape, or form that makes sense for your team and your process. So right now, a typical way that I handle it is I get an email that gives me a notification of what accounts have kind of risen to the top of the bucket on buyer intent. I can look up who owns those accounts in Outreach and see what SDR and what account executive is working the account,
Mm-hmm.
or if it's a current customer, what CSM, what customer success rep is assigned. And then I can reach out to those people via Slack, just a quick note like, hey, Colin, wanted to let you know this company is actively researching companies in our space. Or I can create a task in Outreach on that account and just alert the rep. Especially I'm on the East Coast, so if I do it in the morning, if it's a West Coast rep, I can just create a task in Outreach so that when they come in and open up their computer, they've got an urgent task that I created in their name, just alerting them that this company has shown a little bit of activity.
Got it. And then the expectation from there is that what they just use their best judgment, or is there a playbook that they're meant that works that they can follow to use that?
Yeah, we've started to establish more of a playbook for that. So depending on the type of activity and where the account is in its life cycle, I think Barbara mentioned this, like if you haven't established a good relationship with this account or with prospects in the account, it's not something you want to just go fly out and say, hey, I saw you are visiting G2 crowd. I think it's more it's an awareness thing. Like, okay, if I have 2 or 3 people that I'm actively reaching out to in this account and all of a sudden the account starts to show up on our buyer intent site, maybe I want to put a couple more people active in sequence or log a couple more phone calls on this account and the decision makers I'm reaching out to, just to be able to open up that conversation to more people at the table, so that if I'm not reaching out specifically to the person that is visiting G2 or looking at those resources, then at least there's more people that are talking about the outreach that I'm making. And if it comes up in a team lead meeting or a manager meeting, then they can be like, hey, I got an email from that company today too. Oh yeah, me too. It just becomes the top of mind awareness that we all want to create in the buying cycle. I think you're muted, Colin.
Sounds like you're thinking about using it to make sure the coverage across all the contacts in the account is one of the big focus areas in the way that your SDRs think about using intent data.
Exactly, and also, again, I mentioned this before, but it's worth reiterating. If an SDR is working a large number of accounts, it allows them to know where to focus the majority of their energy. Yeah,
right.
Maybe more resources.
One of Barbara's points, and thanks again, Barbara, was that maybe if you're not mentioning the behaviors, the intent behaviors explicitly, that you can at least use that to ask better questions. And Brett, so I know you said you encourage your SDRs to not put it out there and be proactive, that's some information that they have access to. How do you coach around an SDR messaging and using that to ask smarter questions to their prospects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, right, like looking at things from both the marketing and sales funnel, within both funnels, there's always sort of an element within a bucket there of the buying cycle, right? So what we do know is that from the buyer intent data, that said organization is in some stage of a buying cycle, right? Typically initial eval, right? So for my team, which does primarily outbound work, most of the time the folks that we're calling, we're trying to convince them of why they should enter a buying cycle. Right, we're trying to challenge the status quo, introduce our brand, et cetera, right? With the buyer intent data, so a lot of that work's already done and it's already pre-existing. So we approach it conditionally with the understanding that, again, they're in a buying cycle. So the conversation isn't, this is why you should be in a buying cycle and take a look at Active Campaign. It's, we kind of know you're in a buying cycle, right? This is the value in being educated and having a conversation with an account executive here at Active Campaign.
Interesting. So it almost allows you, where normally you would have to like make some assumptions to go into a conversation with that level of confidence, it almost allows you to behave assumptively without having to make the assumption in the first place because you have a little hint.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. You have the hint, and like for us, the data is really all that we need. Like Chris mentioned, just in terms of like tailoring the message, I have a few sequences built out within Outreach, tailored to specific types of buyer intent data, so that both the written sort of communication and then also the call tasks that we've built in LinkedIn steps, everything is sort of customized to that data. Again, all sort of aligned and rowing in the same direction, singing the same sheet of music, that someone at that organization or a whole group or unit within that organization is in some type of eval stage. And for us, like with the addition of the, compounded by the data that we get, that's really what we need and what we're looking for. Okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We got another really good question here. It's a little bit of a change of topic, but from Azure, I'm sure I'm butchering so many of these names. Azure says that they have access to a third-party intent tool. And I don't know what that tool is, but sounds like there's access to something, to topic count, individual intent scores, and aggregate intent score, which I assume is on the account level. Adam, what do you think of those three as the best predictor of a quality account?
Yeah, I would say, I think like a little bit of it is you kind of have to take the intent data and lay it in a little bit with your own scoring model as well, right? And so we have a lot of integrations, whether it's in the HubSpot or Marketo, or you're pulling that data into Engagio to like try to understand like what's actually happening at the account level. Just saying like, hey, call this account, like this is going to be amazing, right? They might not be the right type of company you sell to, because people, you might have come up and they might just be researching you to understand, and then they realize like, oh, it's not a great fit. So I'm not sure without the exact tool, like out of those three, which might be the best. To me, I think it's looking at the intent as a piece of the overall indicator of like who you should reach out to, right? And from the marketing side, which is, obviously my role, I view it as like such an efficiency gain, because like the way marketers used to operate, right, is like I go out and I spend, let's say $10,000 and I'm just targeting a persona, right? Like I want to target VP of demand gen at, 100-person companies and up. Like, and I have no idea whether they're actually in market or not, but actually like taking the intent data and laying that into my advertising with kind of that persona piece helps me actually understand like, okay, am I targeting the right person who's actually in market now? So I think it's no different than a little bit what Brett talked about. It's like that efficiency gain. So I don't think there's necessarily any right answer to that. It's more of like figuring out what works best for you and your teams.
Yeah, I would think it would rely a lot on like how you find yourself going through the series of sales conversations. Like maybe there's always kind of a blocker role in the sale. Maybe you sell to an industry or a type of, an ICP that happens to always have a really difficult to reach decision maker. Maybe you have a sell to an ICP where the decision maker just happens to not be a committee and the decision maker is almost always the person who's shopping for it. That would probably change how you use those different pieces of information, right?
Yeah, and I also think when it comes to like content and topics and stuff like that too, I think one of the great things is like marketers have done an amazing job putting out a ton of great content. So like, content that Sales Hacker puts out or Outreach puts out, right, is valuable to any sales leader and not just like Outreach customers, right, or Active Campaign. Like, so like a little bit of that is like you get a lot of like people who engage with that content who might not necessarily be in market, because it's valuable content no matter what tool they're on, right? They could be perfectly happy on the tool they're on, but still love the content that their different marketing teams are putting out. So I think my answer to that would be it depends.
Yeah, isn't that always the case? Sorry, Azure, it depends. Hopefully that helped a little bit. I want to take a really quick pause right now, and I'm kind of curious what the audience's experience is with this. So we're going to run a poll. You should see a question pop up on your screen in the Zoom window in just a second. It's a yes or no question. Are you currently using intent data to inform how you sell to your prospects? Yes or no, please just pick one. I know my answer. And I'll close that poll in a few seconds, and then we can all see the results. Okay, I think that's enough time. Let's see what we got. Oh, almost a 50-50 split, slightly more no's than yeses. Lindsay Hugh, Lindsay asked a great question of the audience, and I want to do kind of like a follow-up impromptu poll. So of the people that answered yes to that question, can you just jot in the Q&A, like what's the percentage of your pipeline that you feel like the intent data touches, just anecdotally, like a ballpark figure. And while folks answer that question, Chris, Adam, Brett, if any of you have your own anecdote to share about how much of your pipeline you feel is touched by intent data, like what percentage of the time you get an insight on an account, feel free to share.
I know I mentioned since I kind of coordinate how the information's dispersed to the SDR team at Outreach, it's very small amount when you consider the number of accounts that our SDRs are working.
Yeah.
So I get a daily email from G2, and there's usually roughly a dozen accounts that are populated on there, and those are the most recent, intent insights. There is a link inside there that you can look at historical insights as well. But if you have somebody that's kind of coordinating the disbursement, and if it's a daily task where you kind of clean that out every day, so you figure if we've got somewhere, let's just say 20,000 accounts that are active in our CRM across the SDR org, and we're getting about 12 accounts a day, on an average day. Some days there's more, over the weekend there might be more. So it's a pretty small percent, but I think it's also how you utilize that data. And Adam talked about this too. I think, if your marketing and sales org is using buyer intent data collectively, I think that you can utilize that data to reach out to more pipe based on where marketing spends their dollars, knowing what types of accounts and what types of industries and what types of personas are researching your product. And then also understanding how the pre and post sales team is going to use that intent as well.
Right. Okay. You mentioned earlier that you distribute it manually, but Brett, I forget if we heard how your SDRs receive their intent data. Is it a similar process?
Yeah, it's manual currently, but we're actually building out an integration that is going to have multiple links in the chain, if you will, to go from the G2 buyer intent data into Zoom info to append for contact information for target titles and personas that we're looking for, and then that's going to pump into right into Outreach. So we're currently building that now in-house, so I'm super excited for when that gets done, because I think that's going to increase the velocity and the number of touches that we can get, and then also further pollinate what is already existing, accounts being worked like Chris talked about. And I would say right now, to answer the question that was asked in terms of percentage of G2 buyer intent leads that sort of are cross-pollinating with what's existing, in terms of our total pool, I would say, like Chris said, it's pretty small, but to me, I don't really think that matters, because the way I look at it is, every sales org really kind of lives and dies in the margins, right? So if you can get even just nominal increases, right? So I know for the G2 buyer intent leads, like when we are calling those, the connect rate with those leads is, I think, about 50% higher than
Wow.
calling like regular Zoom info leads, right? So because then again, it corroborates with the fact that somebody there is evaluating. So they're at the very least like willing to like hear what we have to say when we call, even if it's no, right? And as we know in sales, hearing no is better than hearing nothing, right?
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is I think our conversion rate, so once the lead is qualified as an SQL to win, is a little higher as well. I don't think it's tremendous. I think it's like 5%, but again, margins, right? So if I can go from a 20% close rate to a 25% close rate, like I can work with that, and that's something that I can build on.
Okay. And then to Lindsay's question, how much of your pipeline do you, even just like a ballpark estimate, is touched by intent data?
Yeah, I would probably say like 5 to 10%.
Yeah. Okay. So Lindsay, you heard Chris and Brett's answers, a few other answers from the Q&A section for you, Lindsay. Eduardo says basically it's very low. Oliver Waters says it's about 10 to 15%. Yeah. So hopefully that gives you an idea. It sounds like both. I mean, so Brett, you guys are working on integration. Chris, for you, it's still very manual. I'm kind of curious to hear, and maybe Adam, you may even have some like interesting anecdotes about this. So when we think about like scaling this up, kind of operationalizing it a little bit, what systems make sense to integrate? What have you seen some of your customers doing that makes the most sense for intent data at scale?
Yeah, I think the big things is almost like within those buckets we talked about very early on in the conversation is like you need to kind of have that playbook for net new companies you're not necessarily aware of. You need to have the playbook for existing companies you might be working with, you might have an open op with, and then you kind of need to have that playbook for current customers as well. Like, and so there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I think the intent data, I mean, we have our own integrations and alerts that can push into Salesforce, Marketo, HubSpot. You know, we're working on new ones every single day. So I think it's like, how do you take that data and like run the different plays automatically through those systems, right? And so there's a lot of ways you can go about it, but I view each one as like there's a marketing play for it, and then there's a sales play for it, right? So like it works so much better if like, you know, you touched on like, Brett, the 10 to 15% and the higher connect rates, right? Like, and part of that is like on the marketing side, if I know who's in market and I can target those same accounts that Brett's going to be calling, that efficiency should jump up even higher, right? And then I also know like, hey, if I know usually it's not the decision maker we're talking to, I can start targeting those companies at the executive level or whoever that persona is, I should see a higher close rate. So I think it's like, working in coordination, but I think the teams that do really well with using intent data are, you know, sales and marketing are in complete lockstep for what they're trying to achieve, and they're incorporating it into a lot of their strategy. They want to know.
Okay. You froze up for me, at least a little bit, right at the end there, but that makes sense. I mean, it sounds like you're basically saying a lot of the prep around scaling intent data is making sure that there's a playbook in place to address the several different use cases all through the funnel by the marketing team, customer acquisition, retention, upsell, all of that good stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of sounds like maybe it would be the biggest challenge, like maybe not integrating systems, but like preparing everybody to use it in a uniform way. So I'm kind of curious to hear, Chris, like, how do you, I guess, how do you make sure that like reps know? What's the training like? What's the preparation like? And how do you know, how do you make sure the reps know how to use it and that it's relevant to what they're doing or not?
Yeah, I mentioned before, like, you know, the way we're dispersing it right now is mostly through Slack or creating a task within Outreach. But we've presented the information and the process that we want reps to follow in our full team SDR training, which we have on a weekly basis. So we just kind of touch on any kind of new hot button topics and make sure that our reps are presented with that information, and then have an opportunity in their weekly drills to kind of just run some repetitions of it to make sure that they've got that motion down. And again, it's all in coordination with our marketing team too. So as our marketing team, as we've been working to bring in more intent data and get the SDRs to take action on it, we're also coordinating that with the marketing team about how that affects an MQL's life cycle as it goes from marketing to sales, and how a salesperson's going to handle that MQL, that marketing lead, and try to get it to convert over to an opportunity. So it's something that we're working on building out currently, but right now we're focusing on training the team in our weekly trainings and ensuring that they're taking action on those just through our own internal management system.
Yeah. So it's an ongoing process. I mean, it's not like, hey, everybody, you've got intent data, run with it, use it, be more successful. Sounds like something you've been working on for a while and probably will continue to work on for a while. Okay, we've just a quick note, everybody, 5 minutes left in the hour. If you really have a great question, we can squeeze it in. We got one from Kenneth David, just a point of clarification. There's a difference between watching a webinar like this and going and evaluating like 2 intent data providers, right? So I don't think anybody would necessarily call you attending this webinar like you have intent to purchase intent data platform or intent data itself. So just a point of clarification, there's like I mean, maybe it's a spectrum, but there's like a lead and then there's somebody who actually has exhibited intent to purchase. And the way that the intent data works, at least for G2 Crowd, is that you can go in and evaluate 2 platforms or more against each other. That shows that you're actually in a point where you're comparing like features and price and customer service experience, purchase experience, integrations, things like that. You're at a more serious stage of your buyer journey than just wanting to learn about what that platform enables you to do. I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience. Brett, Adam, Chris, any last notes you want to throw out there for the people?
No, I mean, the only thing I would add is just piggybacking on what was discussed here. I think buyer intent data, specifically pertaining to G2, is a great way, I think, to align sales and marketing and sort of like kind of that pitch and catch analogy. We think of it often as a solution for sales teams, and of course it is, but some of the other use cases in terms of retention, reducing churn, intel and pass back data, to the marketing team to create campaigns, gated content material, and things like that to, again, augment with sales. I think there's a lot to build on here, and I think it's just exciting to see how this shapes out.
Yeah, I would just add too, even in addition to what Brett just said, like, being able to just know where everyone in your pipeline is throughout the sales cycle. And using intent data at all points. Another great use case that we didn't really focus a whole lot of time on today was if when I'm doing these daily evaluations, if I see an account is currently in our sales cycle in an open opportunity with an account executive, and then I see them pop up on the intent data alert that they're considering competitors, then I can pass that information along to the account executive and his team or her team so that when they go into the next conversation, they can really understand where that company is and ensure that they're not going to get like attacked by like a last minute competitor that comes in and sweeps us out or throws something, some flashy little thing up to kind of entice them away. So it's just, again, it's just awareness. It's so much about awareness and being able to utilize that awareness in the communication that you have. Barbara said it best, like formulating great questions to ask anytime you have the opportunity to speak with a prospect at one of your accounts or a customer.
Yeah, I think that is a great note to end on, guys, because like we started out talking about how intent data can feel like a buzzword, and oftentimes buzzwords turn into silver bullets. The truth is, any tool, any automation or extra insight in the hands of an unprepared rep or a poorly informed rep or someone who's maybe just new to sales probably isn't going to help. It's going to make a bad rep worse and make a good rep better. So if you have the right approach and you're empathizing with your prospects and selling the right way, then tools like this can help, evolve your situational awareness and help you act better. If not, it's probably not going to be the thing that is a total pipeline crusher for you. There are a couple more questions I'm sorry we couldn't get to. Hopefully you can follow up. We got to close out, everybody. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching. Brett, Adam, and Chris, love to do this again sometime. It was great to have you. Thanks for coming.